Welcome back. This is our last session together. By now, hopefully you've seen all 4 modules and played with all major themes that we've discussed as we've gone through these modules. We want to give a little bit of a bigger picture and some reflections on where the organizational challenges are for these issues and where the future directions are for this field. And we're going to do this quite conversationally, just taking up the questions and kicking it around a little bit. Let's open with organizational challenges. The last module that in the course just before this session was how individuals might navigate the politics and organizational challenges, but that's just the individual level. What about at the organizational level? What can we do as managers to set up the organization for success in people analytics?
I mean, I think one of the real challenges in organizations is the breadth of expertise that needs to be brought together in order to build an effective people analytics function. Because on the one hand, you need an understanding of people decisions. I would be a little nervous if you just brought in a statistician to do this all for you.
A little nervous.
You need to have that background, right? But you also do need somebody who's comfortable analyzing data, understands a lot of the statistical issues that I think you've been talking about in detail, but we've all covered. So you need that expertise. And I mean, in our experience, getting the data is often a bear. I mean, I think increasingly you're seeing vendors selling entirely comprehensive systems. But currently, you've got the personnel data in one system, you've got the applicant tracking data in a different system. If you're lucky, completely divorce them from any workflow data. And so, often part of the challenge is just stitching all of this together. And so somebody who's good with SQL and kind of various other kind of programming techniques is necessary as well. And so just bringing all of that together within the organization, I think, is key.
And I think one of the big questions it really raises is the function or the role of HR, Human Resources Department, within the larger organization, because a lot of this has traditionally been done out of HR departments. The kinds of questions that we're talking about being explored, are, especially in large organizations, are often HR kind of functions. But there's a lot of additional expertise that goes beyond at least the traditional HR functions that is going to have to be brought in. And do you have HR work with other areas that are specialized in these? Do you bring them into HR? I think that's a big challenge that organizations are going to be thinking about in terms of being able to manage these volumes of data, being able to collect really good data, but then being able to process it, draw conclusions from it, and being able to kind of really get change implemented as a result of those data.
I mean, I think the other thing that comes into that is being able to demonstrate the value as well, because what we're talking about is investment, right, and costs. So bringing new skills, hiring new people into the function. One of the things we've mentioned briefly is one of the areas of people analytics is being able to assess the ROI, some of the stuff you're doing around managing people. This is going to need to demonstrate an ROI as well. And so being able to provide quick wins and justify fairly quickly that investment, I think is also something that people are going to need to be able to do.
In a classic organizational behavior kind of way, they also have to navigate how centralized these things are. Because you want them working with the divisions, but at some point the divisions probably want to develop their own capabilities, but how do you do that at scale, and how do you do something centralized and something distributed? It just becomes like any other centralized function. You've got to decide how much is distributed and how much is centralized.
Right. And it's certainly the case, just to underscore Matthew's point, that the data are often not poor, right, and are often very different and fragmented and scattered around organizations. So when we're trying to do analysis on, collect data for our own purposes or research purposes, we're often asking organizations, okay, can you give us good data? And they'll say, well, we have a bit here and we have a bit there. When we actually look at the data, it's often incomplete. And HR has the same challenges in trying to deal with their internal data sets. So trying to develop more systematic ways to collect good data in order to make those measures, again, meaningful, and really being able to rely on the measurement that you have is going to be a challenge. I think that organizations are going to have to invest a bit more. If you can apply all sorts of great statistical tools to large data sets, but if in the end, if those numbers are not meaningful and are not good performance evaluations, for example, it's not going to tell you anything very useful.
This touches on what is another big organizational challenge, and that is what data is okay, what data is too sensitive, what data can you take advantage of, and what data do you need to be careful about. So do you guys have thoughts on where I know there's no easy answer here, but do you have thoughts on this whole issue of ethics around people analytics?
Main thought is that it's a really, really serious, big concern for organizations that has to be taken very, very seriously. I mean, I think the confidentiality of the data that you analyze and that you present to anybody inside the organization has to be absolutely a priority. Using aggregates rather than pulling out individuals is going to be very important. So it's not threatening to people if you talk about averages in their teams or in their units, provided they're of a certain size and you can't actually figure out who are the individuals driving that. Once you get down to anything that can identify individuals, it's really, you have to be really, really careful. So having very good data protection policies in place for that is going to be very important. And then I guess people have to really, you have to think about, do you let people opt in or opt out of having their data used? And again, a lot of data confidentiality and disclosure concerns that are a very, very high priority with doing any of this kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, we've been pushing to some extent a fairly utopian vision throughout this course of look at all these great things we could do to make organizations more effective and make better decisions. There's obviously a dystopian alternative, right, which is we're moving to a world where everybody's being monitored and everything that you do is kind of logged. Right. The opportunities for more and more control of people in fairly negative ways is there as well. And so I think that's going to be an ongoing tension for a while. I mean, in terms of people doing this themselves, I think one of the big issues for me is going to be about the kind of data that you use. So some of this data, it's very clear why it's being collected and what it's being collected for. So if you look at kind of the stuff on applicant tracking systems or kind of basic performance data in the personnel system, I kind of feel like, at that level, people are probably not very surprised when you're running analyses on that. The problem is there's so much other data that's around that you could pick up that people aren't thinking about. Locational data about where they are off any kind of devices that they have. People have started using the badge data when people badge in and out of organizations to, out of the security gate to figure out how long people are spending in the building and so on. I think when you're using data that was clearly collected for another purpose, I think that's when really these kind of questions of consent, particularly when it's then, if it's going to be used to manage them, like you say, whether people opt into the data and so on, I think is going to become more and more important.
It reminds me of that quote about power. Just because you have it doesn't mean you should use it. I know an organization that has all of those data, and they're very sophisticated people analytics organization. They have all that location data, and they've never used it because they realize how sensitive it is and what a potential violation it is. Oh, I do want to give a little pep talk around that, though, in that I also know an organization that consults on wearables, and they have to navigate this exact issue all the time. They have to somehow recruit employees to participate in the wearable study. And they do two key things. One, they make it purely opt-in, voluntary, but then they give them feedback. And people love feedback about how they compare to other people and all the details about their lives and the patterns in their data. And so they provide that as kind of a reward, essentially. And the second is that they guarantee that the organization doesn't get the individual, back to your point about individual versus aggregate, that the supervisors essentially don't get individual level data that they can act on. So with those, what they find with those two, with that reward and that guarantee, they're able to actually pull people in quite happily to participate.
Yeah, I mean, in management, there's this kind of ongoing debate about technology, bureaucracy, all sorts of things. So there's kind of constant theme throughout the literature, which is that any of these things can be used in two ways, like either an enabling way, which is helping people do their job better, empowering people, or a coercive way to kind of exert control. And I think you're going to see that playing out definitely in people analytics. There are lots of ways we could use this. Mm-hmm. I mean, you do figure that kind of the simplest thing for anybody doing this in practice is the kind of Wall Street Journal test, right? Which if this ended up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, how would that work out? Or is this something that, are you comfortable presenting the results of your study in an all-hands meeting, kind of a town hall meeting at work? If yes, go ahead and do it. If no, pause, think twice, figure out are there different ways to do it.
But also, even if you're comfortable, the people whose data are being collected may not be as comfortable. So I think one of the most grey areas is kind of the data, as you mentioned earlier, that kind of emerges as a byproduct of other things that we're doing, and it wasn't meant for that process. So we sometimes call it the breadcrumbs of big data, right? These kind of it's the breadcrumbs that you leave behind when you're doing something else. And so particularly in terms of the collaboration stuff on the communication data, right? So all sorts of, whether it's emails or phone calls or that kind of data that you're doing it for one reason, and people are collecting that data, monitoring that data, and looking at those patterns. Now, there's ways to deal with that to some extent. Looking at the content of emails is very, very different from looking at the number of emails that get exchanged between people, for example. But even if you felt comfortable presenting analyses to your management board, the people whose data were being collected may still not feel comfortable. So these are very, very sensitive issues that need to be thought about at multiple levels.
And kind of when we do these studies, right, I mean, we are subject to a lot of oversight. So every US university has this institutional review board where you have to justify your study, talk about how people are protected. It's very stringent in terms of a lot of the things that you said about not identifying individuals and all these sorts of things. The average corporation has none of this, doesn't have the same legal responsibilities and so on. So I think how they start to think about what the boundaries are, I think is going to be very important.
And probably just holding yourselves to the highest standards is going to be the sensible way to go at this point.
And the field's still being created, and so if people are responsible about this, and the organizations who are doing this at the cutting edge are giving good examples, then it's going to go one way. If people are irresponsible, we have a bunch of bad examples, it could go the other way.
It's almost certainly going to go both ways. I mean, it's...
That's right. Whenever you were talking about utopian versus dystopian, I'm thinking, we're going to get both of those, aren't we?
There's going to, yeah.
That's right.
So you could say choose your employer carefully, but obviously we don't all have a lot of choice in that.
Well, but it's a good thing to emphasize all the same. Okay, we want to close with some thoughts on future directions. We've tried to give people a sense of the state of the art in a few basic application areas that kind of every organization is participating in. These are also areas we've seen companies take up quite quickly. We can give lots of examples in all of these areas. Where do you think we're going? What's the cutting edge here right now, and where do you expect it to grow over the next few years?
I mean, I think some of the most interesting stuff for me is coming out of computer science. So I think a lot of the stuff we've talked about is analytically very simple, right? You've got fairly clean data and you see how one thing correlates with another. When we talk about, we keep talking about all this data that organizations collect, a huge amount of it is unstructured, right? So you've got a lot of documents, you talked about the content of emails, you've got video, voice recordings or whatever. A lot of thought is going on into how do you analyze those, and can we use that to understand? So people, actually the content of people's communication to understand, who's communicating effectively, who isn't, what can we teach people about how to communicate. I hear there's some organization that is trying to create an algorithm that can use a sample of somebody's voice to understand how they'll be perceived by customers from a call center. And so there is, I think there's a lot of kind of the forefront is a lot of this unstructured data and trying to make this kind of rich data more structured. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. Obviously, I think one of the concerns with that is, to a lot of the other things we've been talking about, those algorithms are real black boxes, right? And so, you stick in a sample and it comes out saying yes or no, and I think you become even less comfortable about, do we really have a sense of what's going on in there? But there is possibility there as well.
But the danger is people are selling them as, it's almost the snake oil era that big data has provided, because they act as if, look, just give me all these things and I'll tell you the answer. It's like, that is a really hard task. I mean, it's a really big job. And it's going to be a while until that can be done well. And I'm worried that between now and then, it's going to be sold to lots of people who don't realize that it's not being done well.
Yeah, no, I think that's true.
I think another thing that's really exciting and promising about this is not just big data, but smart data, right? So I mean, yes, there are increasingly huge data sets everywhere. We can collect information on just about everything. But what's really exciting about a lot of these data is that they can get really, really fine-grained into what people are actually doing or where they are, and or how they're communicating in a way that is much more, much richer and more fine-grained than any other data we've ever had before. And so what we can do as a result of that is not just be able to sort of correlate outcomes to things like how many training sessions you went to, but we can actually really get much more fine-grained about what were your behaviors that those training sessions were trying to influence, and can we actually track those behaviors? How much, in fact, are you meeting with, talking with the people that you went to the training session afterwards, for example, and is that one of the benefits of training? What were you actually doing in those training sessions? That how does that content track? So, of course, again, you have to be very careful about imposing too much into people's lives and the confidentiality issues that we were talking about before. But that is also the promise of these data, is that they can get you to a much better understanding what's actually driving outcomes than these kind of more coarse measures that we've used up till now. I mean, one of the other things that I think is really exciting is that once you have a theory or a relationship that you think exists based on analyzing these kinds of data, I think companies are starting to use field experiments much more. And so the idea that you think you know what's going on, and then setting up a kind of pretty rigorous way to test it inside a large organization, finding some part of your organization or two parts that you can compare and running the experiment in one part and not running it in the other part, I think that has a lot of potential. A lot of companies are starting to do that as an outgrowth of kind of what they're able to do, the findings that they're able to generate through these kind of people analytics
techniques. Which is a huge development, because companies have been so reluctant in the past to run experiments on employees, right. Understandably perhaps. But in contrast to the marketing side of the house, where it's the way they've kind of grown up doing business, the A/B test, and with the internet now, it's trivial to run these things. But I think the HR folks, the employee folks, have been influenced by what's going on in marketing, and people increasingly appreciate you need the field experiment to really understand. And so maybe there are ways we can run some experiments with our employees, and in fact we are seeing organizations do that, which is wonderful.
I think this may return to where we were at the beginning of the discussion, but I think it really plays into this kind of centralization, decentralization thing. I mean, I think as this spreads through the organization, I mean, the infrastructure to run these analyses, to do these field experiments and so on, does require some sort of centralized competence. And kind of the trend of the last 30, 40 years has been, more and more of the decision-making and authority going out to line managers. And so it'll be interesting to see to what extent this is able to build up again kind of a sense of competence and a sense of expertise in the center, which can then start to move these topics forward.
Let me add one more, and it's mostly related to Martine's work in these modules, but it cuts into some of ours as well, and that is better evaluation of individual contributions to team efforts, which really is everything. And we've just been so individual focused historically, and by that I mean the last, all of human history, right? We miss the interactions. We miss the subtleties of the positive consequences of someone working with the team that kind of gets, below the radar, or the negative consequences. And I know this is one of the things that people grapple with a great deal in the sports world. And I'm optimistic that some of the techniques from that world are going to flow down into other organizations, but the collaborative tools that you talk about give us some insights that we've never had before. And the hope is that we can start identifying the individuals who make contributions to teams that people don't appreciate, and the behaviors that people exercise or don't exercise that make positive contributions to teams.
And hopefully also, how people actually experience the workplace, and whether they feel pressured by some of those expectations, or they could contribute more and they don't. And so where do you intervene to help bolster their skills, or to train them better, or to maybe reduce the burden on them if it's not working so well. So the fact that we can really get much deeper into what people are actually doing in the workplace in all these ways has a lot of positive potential, as well as some dangers that we need to be very careful about.
Yeah, I mean, I think beyond isolating the impact of the individual, it may be also just starting to take the team seriously as a unit, right? So, I mean, there's always this risk that it's like, okay, but we really want to know what each individual is contributing.
Okay.
Almost by doing that, you start to disrupt the team dynamic. And it may be sometimes we're actually better off just saying what makes teams work.
Yeah. And also developing measures that can be good measures of team outcomes, and what are the behaviors of individuals that actually contribute to the team outcomes. All of that is stuff that we should be able to do now.
We're certainly not going to be stuck for questions anytime soon.
No, exactly. Well, this has been fun, guys. Till next time, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much.